Good morning. For those that are checking in, we're just giving everyone a few minutes to check in before we get started. All right, good morning, everybody. And I believe we'll probably still have some more trickle in, but we can go ahead and get started. My name is Donna. I work with the City of Paso Robles as the parking coordinator, and I am the SWAPTA webinar coordinator. Been really looking forward to this presentation by Mike Nickolaus. He's going to teach us all about collection rates. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike to start his presentation.
Thank you, Donna. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you guys today. It's on the one hand, it's a pretty mundane topic, and some folks might be thinking, how are we going to fill an hour on collection rate? As somebody who's done this for quite some time, I actually, as I was put together, realized this is really just kind of an introduction. This could go on for hours, if not longer. So what I hope to do is really explain to you why I do believe that collection rate is such an important measure of your program and how it unlocks insights to the rest of the things associated with your citation processing program, and kind of whet your appetite to dig into that a little more, and also give you some tips about how to calculate it. So I'm just to set kind of a framework. At the end, I've told Donna I'll share the presentation. There's also a kind of a worksheet that I go through at one point. So that'll be available through SWAPTA for anybody who wants it. I'm also going to leave about 15 minutes at the end for any questions. So with that, I'll get going. As Donna said, my name is Mike Nickolaus. Just a little bit of background so you guys know kind of where I come from. I've been in parking for 33 years, and I've led organizations that have processed and collected over 100 million citations. I spent 15 years at what's now Conduit, when it was both Lockheed and ACS, and I ran their citation processing business for 4 of those years. We had a lot of large and mid-sized cities, LA, San Francisco, Boston, Philly, et cetera. You can kind of read them there. I also have experience implementing other citation-based programs, not exclusively parking. So some of you may be from Arizona and familiar with the FAIR program. I helped develop and implement that back in 2003. Also put together a statewide motor vehicle surcharge program in New Jersey. And back in the 90s, I implemented the electronic toll collections operations program for the New York City MTA. So, dealt with lots of different kinds of clients. I then ran Duncan Solutions for 9 years, 200 different processing and collection clients, including, San Diego, Sacramento, a number of others here, the Inglewood Consortium. and also collected citations for about 24 total authorities, and then spent 5 years with CivicSmart with hundreds of clients that issue handhelds. So that's kind of where I bring my perspective from. So what do I hope you'll learn today? So, and this was sort of in I think the ad that brings folks, but how to calculate your collection rate. Even more important than that, though, is the importance of it. There's so much information that can be gleaned when you understand your collection rate that I can't emphasize enough that I think it's probably the single most valuable tool to help you figure out where you should be working on next to improve both the performance and the perception of your program. That kind of is that third bullet there, where to improve and how to improve. And also how do you measure and compare your performance, but also your vendor's performance. Many of you have a vendor, and if you've been locked into them for a long time or are just new, you may wonder, well, how are we doing? And unfortunately, there's no real standard in the industry to how to calculate some of these collection rates. I'm hopeful that that's something that could happen. I'll touch on that at the end. So, most of you, I'm sure, have your parking revenues prices with COVID. And so figuring out how to increase your collection rates, the importance of that's probably never been higher. So why are parking citation revenues important? Historically, when I was coming up back in the 80s and 90s, cities generated 5 to 7 times as much revenue from their tickets as they did from their meters. Last 10 years, the addition of mobile apps, credit card meters, increased and demand-based rates have increased the meter side, but most cities still get 3 to 5 times more revenue from citations than meters. Enforcement staffing is typically the largest labor expense for the on-street parking program. So you want to be deploying, when you spend that money in those folks, you want to make sure that you're getting return on the efforts of their ticket writing. As I said, I think you guys know better than I do, the decline in issuance in the last 15 months will be probably slow to rebound, but citation revenues are a large budget item. And so collecting what you issue should remain a priority. But it's also not just about the money. There's a quote here that I started using about 20 years ago that I think applies. The certainty of enforcement creates a culture of compliance. You all know how valuable your curb space is. And it's valuable because it's scarce and different folks have a different view of how it should be used. And we've never seen that more probably than in the last year or so, where curb management, with parklets and outdoor dining became even more important. So you guys as parking professionals and your policymakers, your elected officials, you establish regulations to kind of balance these views, and you decide what parking behaviors you want. And to a significant chunk of those drivers, they'll only follow it if they think there are consequences to not doing it. And the threat of getting a ticket is the most common consequence. But if you're someone who views that you don't have to pay your ticket, then there's no real need to follow the rules. So measuring collection rate gives you insights into whether residents, visitors, motorists, business owners believe that the program is working to the extent that they should follow those regulations. And that's ultimately what you want. You want, deterrence rather than having to go after and collect. So why is collection rate important? To use a health metaphor, right? It's like your annual physical. It allows you to diagnose your entire processing program. We'll touch on that. It's a comprehensive, objective way to evaluate your vendor's performance if you have one. I refer to it as like getting a second opinion, because if you can compare your vendor's performance to others or peer cities, you get a better sense of whether you're being well served. And it's also a way to measure your improvements. So it's kind of like taking your temperature on a regular basis. You can see each month, are the things we're doing resulting in the outcomes we want. So I just put this schematic up because it informs how I think of collection rate, but also other metrics in the program. So, on the the left of the screen there, you have ticket issuance, right? And that kind of initiates the whole process. And after a ticket's issued, the first thing you can do is you can wait at the top there to have online payments come in. People will mail in payments. Some people may walk in and pay. But if they don't, then you need to go out and based on the driver's license, the license plate, you have to get a name and address, and then you have to mail notices. And so sort of every step along the way there are things that you can measure, whether it's a mail house vendor, a processing vendor, your own productivity. And each measurement there gives you insight as to how your program's going. After notices are mailed, right, payments will come in again. But then if things continue out, you may get hearings requested. You may go on to other sanctions like booting and towing, sweep noticing, or other enforcement sanctions like tax intercept, registration hold. This is the simplified view, but I think if you look at collection rate as kind of one of the core measures that runs through this, it gives you insights into how these different aspects are performing. So one of the things I hear is, well, there are a lot of different collection rates. So what rate should I use? So I thought it'd be helpful for our presentation and hopefully for you to take away. I sort of think of it in these four main rates. And, the first is the windshield rate, right? And those are the tickets that are paid before the first notice and penalty. And I think that's, there's definitely kind of a regional impact on that. I mean, if you're a city with a lot of tourists or a large college population, that may be depressed because people feel like they're only an itinerant visitor. But basically it reflects the reputation your program has for effectiveness and for fairness. And it's a measure sort of that culture of compliance. So if people who receive a ticket on their windshield are paying 50% before you have to notice, you're doing pretty well. And regardless of what the number is, if you can improve that over time, it'll give you evidence that the perception of your program is improving. The payment rate is those citations that are fully paid. And we'll touch on full versus partial payment in a bit. But that's the measure of those who believe that it was issued fairly and they pay. It's at any point in the life cycle. And then you have the dismissal rate, which are those that are suspended or voided or canceled following a hearing or an administrative review. I'm excluding kind of warnings and voids because those aren't really placed on the windshield with an expectation of being paid. These are ones that have gone through that process. And then if you add the payment rate and the dismissal rate, you get a closure rate. And that's a useful measure as well. So I think it's worth decomposing it that way. So this presentation started over a year ago when there was something on the IPMI blog that I responded to. And it was, one of the questions was around, well, what do you put in the numerator and what do you put in the denominator? So, I think that the denominator is fairly simple. And so it should be those valid citations that you issue, which exclude warnings and field voids. So it's the tickets that when your enforcement officer places them, you expect them to get paid. And then you can divide that number by the fully paid citations for a payment rate and the closed citations for the closure rate. And the difference is the dismissal rate. So it sort of solves for itself. Now, one thing I just wanted to kind of help folks think through this. I had a client, I checked the list, they're not on here now. They've all retired anyway. And they were insistent on using the face value of the tickets issued in the denominator and that the dollars received in the numerator. And I caution you not to do this, but it highlights, from my perspective, kind of why you want to establish benchmarks that you can track over time, because that approach really distorted the way they thought about their program's performance, because whenever they changed the fine amounts, it changed the perception of their collection rate performance, even if there was no change. If they changed their penalty amounts, if they added a new penalty in the cycle, or even change in the citation mix, if you're start issuing, a different kind of ticket with a higher value, it distorts it. And I have just kind of a simple example here of sort of what I mean by that, just to stick in your mind. So the yellow column there is a basic measurement. If I issue 10 tickets and I collect 4 of them before the first penalty and 3 of them after the first penalty, that's 7. That's a 70% collection rate. And that's stable regardless of the dollar amount of those tickets, any penalties, whatever. If you look at the blue one, which is actually quite similar to the way they viewed it, they had a very low dollar value ticket before the first penalty, $6. After the penalty, it jumped up to $20. So if you use dollars collected, you'd get $24 before the first penalty, another $60 after, and you issued $60 worth of face value, you'd actually have a collection rate that exceeds 100%. And then let's say later the council decides that that $20 penalty is too expensive and they want to cut it back to 12. Then if you look at the green, suddenly that's changed your collection rate again and down to 100%. So, the numbers aren't important. What I hope you get is just the measure. It's useful to understand the dollars because they're important. But in terms of this kind of a measurement, I think if you focus too much on that, it gets distorted. Many of you have also probably been the victim of, those articles that say, oh, your town has $500,000 in uncollected fines, or $1 million or $2 million. Rarely do those articles highlight that you may have never archived those tickets for very good reasons, and it could represent 20 years worth of receivables that will always grow unless you collected more than 100%. I think by having a strong, solid collection rate, definition, it gives you a weapon or a tool, depending on how you need to use it, for folks both within the city and in the community that says, no, we're doing a very, credible and effective job in doing this. One of the things that I've learned in working with courts over the years, which when I first started was a surprise. I mean, probably like most of you, if I get a moving violation in my home state or elsewhere, I worry about paying that, regardless of whether I think it's fair or not. I don't want it to go on my insurance. I don't want points on my license. So I would have assumed that collection rates were much higher in a court environment. Turns out that's not true. Pretty consistently, a well-run parking program will have a much higher collection rate. So it gives some context to the efforts you're doing and how hard it is to do what you do. Okay. So how should partial payments be handled? Been asked this, and I'm going to highlight here some of the issues around it. You can handle it, based on what suits you. But I think there's some things worth understanding about them as you make that decision. So oftentimes partial payments are made when somebody tries to game the system, right? They forget about the ticket, it's sitting on their dashboard or on their desk, and they realize that the penalty was applied yesterday, and they quick try to pay it in the hopes that you won't collect the balance. Now, that's one example, but partial payments can also highlight some operational issues that you should be aware of. So it's useful, maybe not every month, but to periodically check your partial payment rate to see if any of the things kind of on the right might apply. So for example, if your noticing cycle is too tight and they don't have time to pay their first citation, I mean, you can always say, well, you could go online and you could pay it that day, but practically speaking, if you're applying a ticket or mailing a notice within 7 days or 10 days, that may be contributing to, a higher partial payment rate, and it may be something worth discussing. The other thing is your payment processing may take too long. A lot of vendors will pretty much commit to almost 100% of the payments that are received that day being posted because they're using high-speed remittance processing. But if you're in a city where maybe it goes to a mailroom and or your own staff do it, but maybe there's only one person and they're out that week, right? If it takes too long to post those payments, those notices may be getting mailed and appear to be partial payments. Whether they are or not, it still results in some if you look there, increased calls, people, requesting hearings, they're frustrated. They're also printing and mailing notices that you don't need to. The other issue is you can, put in a longer grace period. So the due date might be after 7 days, but maybe you don't start your noticing process until 10 days to give time for those payments to be cleared. So, I say that to just provide some nuance about collection rates and partial payments. If you don't have a lot of partial payments, or if you're not pursuing them, which I would recommend not pursuing, then you may not need to track it every month, but you should check in and take a look at least periodically to see your partial payments. And hopefully those are, migrating into full payments. So another question, we talked before about a dismissal rate and, how should they be handled? I advocate removing them, from the payment rate and from, but including them in the closure rate and including them in the denominator. Because I think that, like so much of collection rate, when you're monitoring it, you'll learn things about your program that you may not know otherwise. So, for example, if there are consistent ticket writing errors, it can be as simply highlighting that your PEOs need retraining. But those will show up in hearing requests and then dismissed tickets. So, by looking at that, you can kind of say, well, why are these tickets getting dismissed? Oh, okay, I see what it is. Similarly, as we've moved to mobile apps and all of these things, it's hard to keep everything in sync. So you might have signs that are dated. You might have the meter hours on the rate card or on the pay station. You may have a mobile app that says this is the rules for this space or this block face. And then the handheld software should have similar information. And in a perfect world, all of that is in sync. But, must operate in a perfect world. And so if you keep an eye on your dismissal rate, you may realize that, hey, something's out of whack. And so you can hone in and alleviate that. One of the other things that drives up the dismissal rate is whether your court or your own adjudication, if it's an administrative adjudication process, has a reputation of leniency. I've worked with cities where the reputation is, if you appeal a ticket, more often than not, particularly if it's a court system, the judge, and they're often elected at that level, they'll just dismiss the ticket. So, if too many of them are falling into that bucket, it's worth having a conversation. I mean, I know none of you have control over judges. Judges don't think anyone has control over them in their courtroom. But, there is accountability there. And if judges are being too lenient in dismissing too many tickets, it undercuts what you're trying to achieve, not just on the revenue generation side, but also on the compliance with the regulations that you guys are putting out there. And, the fourth thing is just, when tickets are being dismissed, you want to make sure that there's no malfeasance going on. And by that, I mean, there are different kinds of dismissals. And if there are dismissals, folks, it's one thing if it's a court deciding it, whether you agree or not, but you really should be monitoring your audit trail and sampling to make sure that there's enough documentation to support those dismissals. And quite honestly, that could be a whole separate webinar. I can't even remember all the different ways that my clients' staff have, and in a couple instances, our own staff have figured out how to cheat the system. So that's something else that, in addition to doing things like, running dismissal reports and looking at them in more detail, that audit trail, even just keeping an eye on your dismissal rate is quite helpful there. So, one of the other questions that is often raised, and I'm not saying that my recommendation is perfect or anything, but I will tell you how I get to it. So you can tweak it based on your circumstances. So when you think about what is my collection rate a short-term rate, midterm, long-term, over what period of time should I collect things, and how should I measure myself? From my perspective, there are seasonal effects of collections, including things like tax intercept, if your state affords that sanction. There's sweep noticing and other long-term things. There's booting and towing. You should be continuing collections efforts over multiple years. It's not terribly effective to mail 3 notices and then just call it quits. If that's the case, then you're not going to have much of a change in your collection rate after 6 months versus after 2 years. Whereas if you are continuing to apply sanctions, you should see it go up. And so I think it's useful. To me, the benchmark rates that I always looked at were first the 2-year, both payment and closure rate, but also 1 year. And if you don't have a tax intercept program, or if you don't really have any effective sanctions after 1 year, then you could probably just focus on that. But as long as you're running a report once it's built, it's not hard to incorporate these longer term horizons. And I think what's helpful about that too is all of the things that you learn and you turn around and try to put them into your program efforts. And when you advocate for tools, once you have a well-run program, we're talking incremental value. I mean, adding some of these things, they're not going to increase your collection rates by 10% if you already run a well-run program. You may be doing things that increase it 1 or 2%. And when you put them all together, it's 5%. That's a tremendous accomplishment. Now, if you're new to a program that wasn't terribly well run and you're sitting on a collection rate in the 60s, then yeah, you start doing this, you'll get in, depending on what state and what tools you are, you'll get into the 70s, 80s, depending on your community, maybe even higher. So, I think it's all a function of where you come from. And that's why tracking it diligently over time, I think really helps you see how, the progress you're making. I think it's useful to have a shorter term, and I put in here 3 months, because to me, I always use that as an early warning sign if we're missing noticing cycles. Sometimes a vendor won't send the file or the mail house won't mail it. And, there should be other reports that tell you that, but if, you got a lot on your plate and you don't notice that, or if payments aren't posted, or if there's, I've been in situations where DMVs cut off access for a period of time. You may not know that. It's hard for you to stay on top of all of that. But if suddenly you see I'm making it up, but an 8-point drop in your 3-month payment rate over the course of a couple months, that's a real clue. What's going on there? Why am I suddenly dropping? Because it should be more stable than that. And kind of keeping with that, I touched on the windshield rate. I always like to look at a 1-month payment rate. Now, if you've already mailed 2 notices by a month, then you would probably want to shorten that. But if you have a program where typically, you write a ticket and then, if it's California, 3 weeks later, you mail a notice, looking at 1 month really gives you a benchmark of, people who are paying because they feel like they should do that, whether they feel an obligation because they're a good citizen, or they know that if I don't, I'm going to end up paying more with penalties or get booted, et cetera. So those are kind of the 4 timeframes that I think help you kind of get those insights, that you're looking for. So in addition to the time horizon, how often should I calculate my collection rate? I really think that this has to be a part of your monthly key performance indicators. So most of you probably are getting a set of monthly reports, either from your vendor or your staff, or you're thinking now about how do I, what frequency. This is so important that I always required all of the project managers who worked for me to submit that as part of a monthly report, because at a glance, I could see whether things were heading in the right direction or not. I also think, though, that as you guys probably know, individual months, can be volatile, whether it's you're in a university and things change at, a couple times during the year. So I like to take those 4 measures and use a rolling 12-month average. So that smooths out some of those seasonal and short-term variances. It just makes it a little more robust. But the important thing is to be consistent. And if you track it over time and you identify both shortcomings, but also improvements, you'll start to see that collection rate increase. And I think it's not only comforting to know that based on your responsibilities, but when you're talking with elected officials or your boss or the public or the media, being able to have that insight allows you to articulate it, really how well you're doing. So, and if it's a case that you have a vendor whose system you're relying on, if they haven't already, they should be able to develop a report that meets your requirements and give it to you on a monthly basis. And I would suggest that every quarter you sit with them and, take a look at what it tells you, because it may highlight things you want them to focus on or to do better. Now, while your vendor can provide you the report, I do want to share and kind of understand at a little more granular level, kind of what a report kind of could look like. So I'm using as an example from May 2021, and this would be a report that would say that you could have your vendor run or run yourself, that as of May 31st. So when I say a 1-month collection rate, to be honest, I'm giving a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. But what I'm saying is that any ticket that was issued in April of that month, so it could have been April 1st or it could have been April 30th, you have total number issued. By the end of the following month, how many are paid, how many are dismissed, and that sums to how many are closed. And then you get those collection rates, and that's your 1-month rate. And then you could only do the color highlighted ones if you only wanted to look at those 4 rates. I don't think there's any harm when your vendor is building this out to have it go back 2 years. You do the same thing for June, right? You just shift it up a month. And in this case, you could see that 7 were paid in April, and then there are 8 paid in June. And when I say a rolling 12-month average, then for payment rate, dismissal rate, and closure rate, you can pull in your June number, your May number. Now, because I didn't have data going back, there aren't 3-month, 1 year, 2 year, but those can be in there. And then you can average those up. So what you'll be able to see at a glance is over the last 12 months, how has it moved? And if there are any seasonal variables, that'll be reflected in your 12-month average.
Hey,
So
Mike,
that's, yes.
sorry to interrupt, but your report is not showing on the screen. We just see PowerPoint.
I apologize because I'm sure I'm sharing. Bear with me 1 second. I pulled it up on my screen, but, and I see everybody was chatting with me. Sorry about that. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we can see it.
Okay, so I apologize. I'm going to go back. Yeah, as you probably all know, one of the things from Zoom is you can actually share your screen, or you can share a window from your screen. And I succumbed. So let me go back here. We've got some time. So when I started, I mentioned this May 2021 tab. And this is where you could have your vendor, as of May 31st, any payments that were made in April, that were made on tickets that were issued in April, whether from the 1st to the 30th, how many were paid, dismissed, and the sum of that is closed. And that represents your 1-month rate for May. Similarly, when you heard me say, you could only focus on having your report for the colored lines and get your 3-month, your 1 year, your 2 year. But when you're building the report, there's not much added effort to put issued in the last 24 months or so, 24, 25 months, and then the number paid, dismissed, and closed. You do the same the next month for those tickets issued in May that were paid as of the last day of June. And then you have a rolling tab where this highlights averages the following 12 months. Since I didn't fully populate the data for the balance of the months beyond the first two, those are blank, but you can pull those in. So this is kind of a template that lets you both track your 12-month rolling average, but also see over the last 12 months what's happened with your payment rate, your dismissal rate, and your closure rate for different time periods. And this is also going to be available if, for anybody who wants it, just ask Donna and she can, provide you with a copy of it. All right. Now let me go back. Okay. Are you guys back to my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, once you, again, to me, the value of understanding and measuring your collection rate is it gives you the clues as to what you need to do to maximize your collection rate. And, this is something that's most often done in partnership with your vendor. But by the same token, you don't want to, abrogate all your responsibility to your vendor because it is a program. So, the first thing that I would suggest is, mastering the basics. So, reviewing your notices. Are you using full notices versus postcards? Are you including business reply envelopes? Are you printing in color and not just black and white? When I talk about small incremental improvements, if you're printing in color, including a full-size notice with a business reply envelope, if your tickets and your notices include a QR code to get to your web portal, all of these things will be the kinds of enhancements that will move you up on your collection rate up. Promoting your web payment portal is extremely valuable because when people have to, like many of us probably, it's such a pain when you have to mail in a check these days. So if you're able to get folks to get to your web payment portal, they're going to act more likely and more reliably than if you're waiting for them to mail it in or, heaven forbid, walk in. You also would want to make sure your payment portal is optimized for mobile phones, because if you put that message on that ticket that it's easy for them to know that they can pay right from there, and it resolves very conveniently, it just aligns with all the other trends in e-commerce. So those are the kinds of things I think that you can start with and can probably make, depending, you may find sort of really easy low-hanging fruit. When you get more complicated, right, you need accurate names and addresses. So it's not part of this collection rate webinar, but if you think about your collection rate, that life cycle of a ticket, folks don't pay off of the windshield. Your next step is getting a name and address from a license plate. And those of us who've been in the industry for a long time appreciate how hard that is. Depends on which state, depends on how many out of state you have. There's different states have different databases for temporary plate tags and for plate types and for apportion plates. And so it's really something you want to do with your vendor, to sit down and say, hey, why are we, because if you can't mail a notice, then you can't even begin to expect to collect it, right? So why are we not getting 100% hit rate? And there are very valid reasons. And also, as we all know, many DMVs just don't have accurate data. So that's, something that you can drill down. And I will highlight, I know there's been a lot of talk emerging over the last year or two about mailing notices, whether it's because of the perception of safety, whether it's because efficiency. If I have LPR trucks driving around and a plate doesn't have a permission or a payment for that location, I could just store it and mail it out. Absolutely true. And I'm not making a judgment or have an opinion one way or the other. I think there's some benefits to that. But I think you also need to be mindful as you think about that what that does is it effectively reduces your issuance. So, if you put 100 tickets on a windshield, your denominator is 100, and you could expect that, whatever your collection rate is applied across those 100. If you're in a state where your DMV hit rate is 92%, then if you scan and get 100 hits, but can only mail 92 accurate plates, then your effective issuance is really only 92. Now, you can say it's still on them, and there's some other skip tracing sanctions down the way if they haven't updated their name with the DMV. But if the DMV can't tell you, so whatever efficiencies you're gaining, you probably want to at least be mindful that there is an inefficiency because, as I said, your effective issuance might be reduced 5, 8, 10%. And probably, the most important thing when you're doing everything else right, you need effective enforcement tools. Wisconsin, it's prohibited by state law. You can't boot. They had a rule, I don't know if it's still a law, where if you towed, you only had to pay the tow fee. You didn't have to pay the tickets, and you get your vehicle back. When you look at states that have booting and towing versus don't, you're probably looking at about a 5% collection rate boost if you have that. Those of you in California, right, you can collateralize tickets across different jurisdictions. Certain, like the West Side cities have done that, I know. In their states where you can collateralize them across plates. So if you own multiple plates, your tickets can be aggregated. I think Michigan comes to mind. If you have those kinds of tools, you'll be able to increase your enforcement. More basic ones that you can take advantage of is skip tracing. If your vendor, whether you have a processing vendor who's also responsible for collections, or if you have a separate collections vendor, really make sure that they're doing an effective job at skip tracing. Because that ability to find updated names and addresses from multiple sources will also be able to increase your collection rate in that kind of 5% or more range. And then, finally, if your state allows registration hold, or there are a few, Michigan is one that allows license suspension, you really want to be taking advantage of that. So, if your vendor doesn't offer that now, you probably want to talk to the DMV or the Secretary of State, figure out how you can get plugged into that. Because that's another example for those hard to collect where, you can make progress in that. Credit bureau reporting used to be a similar tool that's not available to you guys anymore. And then the same thing with tax intercept. Tax intercept can be very valuable for folks who are getting a tax refund or, lottery proceeds or child support. It falls behind child support, but folks where there's money being withheld from tax refunds. So again, that's something you want to look at if your state allows that for parking tickets. So just kind of going to wrap up the next 5 minutes or so to leave time for questions, right? How do you evaluate vendors? I mean, for many of you on the call, you either have a court or you've got a vendor. I mean, there are some programs that run it in-house, but it's hard because if you run it in-house, maybe your police are using MLETs to get out-of-state names and addresses, or maybe you don't have a lot of them. But that's hard to do on a one-off basis. And there are a whole host of other things around permits and fleet management and rental cars and things where a vendor can add a lot of value. That's one of the other things that I didn't mention, but when you do a hit rate analysis or you look at your collection rate, understanding if a vehicle is a rental vehicle, there are some really powerful tools for vendors who have access to the databases. There are a couple key databases where if they submit a ticket from that was issued on a vehicle while it was rented, you don't just get the name and address. They will pay you the value of that ticket. And your vendor does that behind the scenes all the time. They can match it up against a list of plates they get from the large rental agencies. So again, depending on who your vendor is, you should look, is that a tool they have access to and are they doing it? Because if not, that's another, again, depending on where you live, if you're in more of a tourist area, that can be another multi-percentage point bump in collections through no effort of your own. So, what I would suggest is, you want to take a look at yours or other vendors. At the bottom, it says you can do this with your current vendor or as part of a procurement process, right? Request copies of standard collection reports and take a look at them based on what you've learned today and what else you learned. Ask to see collection rates for comparable clients, your size, your state, and get a benchmark of how they're doing. I think it's useful to ask for them to write down how they calculate collection rate. As we said, there are multiple ways to do that. So not only do you want to make sure that you're kind of comparing apples to apples, but you want to make sure that your vendor can articulate, why that's the case. And just for those who are wondering, I mentioned who I used to work for. I don't work for anybody in the parking industry anymore. I've done last year a little bit of consulting, but I'm kind of out of it. So I'm offering this up for those of you who might be wondering, without any other motives at all, but just sharing what I've learned. And then one thing that I really would encourage folks to do is, as part of a procurement or as part of an evaluation, to give vendors a list of the same 100 to 250 license plates and basically ask them to provide you names and addresses for these, within a reasonable period of time, 2, 3, 4 weeks. You could include that file as part of your RFP, for example, for those who, maybe it's those who are shortlisted. But when you get that back, say you've shortlisted 3 vendors and you get back and one has provided, 90 names and addresses out of 100, and one's provided 80 and one's provided 70 and an excuse, that's useful information when you're trying to figure out who to go with, because, the revenues that you generate from a higher collection rate typically more than cover cost savings. If you save a dime or 25 cents a ticket, but your collection rate goes down even a couple points, you're usually, worse off financially. And then I think the last slide here, I touched on in the beginning, IPMI is helped form, some of you are familiar probably with APDS, the Alliance for Parking Data Standards, with I think the European and the British Parking Associations. And it's about standardizing mostly the on and off street elements, like how do you define a space or a regulation, a duration, but there's really nothing in it about ticket processing, citation processing elements. And I really think that the industry as a whole would benefit from working together on a collection rate standard. And it would allow you guys to compare vendor performance. It would allow you to compare your performance against peer cities. And over time, it would also help benchmark best practices, because when your collection rates are at the top of the list, people are going to want to know, what is it that you do? So, maybe there's somebody much younger in their career on this call who's motivated to say, gee, that's something I'd like to take the lead on, or maybe swap the ones to take the lead on it. Because I think there'd be a lot of benefit, and it would raise all boats, because as soon as you start doing that, all vendors are going to have to meet, a higher standard, or it'll be clear that they're not. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions. I think we've got, about just 15 minutes left.
Thank you, Mike. That was very informative, super helpful. As Mike said, he'll be sending me the presentation and the spreadsheet. I'm happy to send it to anyone that is interested in having it. I'll send it on to Dawn and Marty as well to see if we can get it posted. With that, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or post it in the chat. We're a quiet group this morning.
I either answered everybody's questions or I answered nobody's questions, and they thought this was going to be about something else.
You answered all of my questions, that's for sure. Donovan is requesting maybe if you can scroll back through some of the slides.
Sure. Oh, yeah, let me see here. Sure. Any slide in particular? Or you just want to?
Let me see. I think, Donovan, I think I changed your permission so you can speak if you want to speak up.
I was actually looking for ideas for questions by just reviewing some of the slides.
Oh, got it. Maybe what I can do here is, let me change the view. Maybe I can view more like that. If that, can you see that?
Yes.
So let me scroll down. Well, maybe I'll ask a question because I know this is one that's often thrown out there. For those of you who calculate a collection, regardless of whether it's consistent with what I recommend, what kind of collection rate are you seeing now? I kind of grew up where in the large cities, if you were between kind of 70 to 80%, you were doing pretty well. I know there's some small cities that are blessed to get 85, 90%. Others that, maybe if they're dependent on a court, they have unique situations, might be below that. So, do folks, what are your guys' current collection rates? Actually, I just saw a few questions in the chat, so thank you. So Nick from Denver, I asked a question here. You guys can probably see it on my screen. I'm not sure if I'm sharing it, but what are your thoughts on using collection agency for multiple unpaid tickets who refuse to pay and have been towed or booted several times? I'm a big proponent of using a secondary collection efforts, whether it's a separate agency or a processing vendor who's a licensed collection agency. I think you absolutely want to be pursuing that because, particularly if you have the ability, many cities and states allow the collection fee to be added on. So it's really, you're not losing anything from doing it. So for example, I think in Florida, you can add 40%, in Texas, you can add 30% or 25%. If you add that on, and if the vendor's successful, they're taking that off and you're getting the full value that went to collections. And the other thing it does is it frees you up from having, you can focus your efforts instead of worrying about the collection fee that the vendor charges. Somebody comes in at 8%, somebody at 15, somebody at 25. If it's being added on, it's kind of moot because you can focus on who you believe will have the best collection rate, because you're getting your same amount. So that's my thought about that. Then I see Donovan said that his on-time collection rate dropped this last year. That's probably not a surprise. Just in general, I suspect you're not alone, Donovan. And then I saw that a DMV no-hit report is up to 20% of all citations with no hits from the DMV. That's awfully high, man. I don't know what state you're in, but that's something you might want to talk to a couple vendors about. And the reason I say that is, there are different sources for getting DMV information. Obviously, you can go to the DMV, but that isn't the only way. There are some other skip tracing sources that have files of the DMV. They can be a little dated, but nonetheless, The other issue that I touched on, and this goes into a hit rate analysis, because it sounds like what you really need is somebody to help you with the hit rate analysis. Because if you have a state, for example, that has the plates in different, there might be a commercial plate file and a regular plate file and a temporary tag file. If your system or your vendor system isn't capturing plate type and going to the right file, then you may be getting a higher no hit rate than needed. So looking at every one of those no hits and decomposing why it is it a bad ticket, right? If an I is being searched as a 1, I mean, there's all kinds of rules around DMVs, the rule of 8, license plates couldn't have more than 8 plates. So, if you have stacked letters, if people are entering those stacked letters as, full characters, all those things, your vendor should be able to sit with you and screen that to improve your hit rate. Then if your DMV still has issues, you've done everything you can. Hey, Ted. Do you know any consultants who audit enforcement operations and incorporate this type of information? Yeah, I don't, and I'm not saying that like I'm trying to backdoor hang my shingle out, because it's something that I've kind of talked to consultants when I was on the vendor side. When I was on the vendor side, as you can tell, I was kind of passionate about this. And I felt that once we had a period of time with our clients, we were doing a really good job. So one of the things that frustrated me was when the consultants who help cities write RFPs would write RFPs that I didn't feel appreciated this nuance. And whether it's an RFP related, I was, of course, as a vendor, more focused on RFPs at the RFP stage. So I can't point to any that are doing that. I think you raise a good point. It's not necessarily only involved with that. I mean, there are plenty of cities who are very happy with their vendors, but they and their vendors in partnership could do a better job. So, I don't really, I haven't seen that. You could talk to the kinds of consultants who are out there and see if any of them are doing that. And, if you have some particular folks in mind, you can, happy to give me a call. The last slide is my contact information, just my generic Gmail. You followed up there, right? Connecting with IPMI to gather anonymous data. I think that's a great idea. And I think if IPMI could be turned on to it, they would be probably a great place to start. They could tie it into their accredited organizations. They could tie it into their standards. They have a couple different ways. I was sad to say that after I put this together for SWAPTA, I submitted a similar presentation proposal for the IPMI conference, and it was rejected. So, I know they're full. I'm not doing that. I think you can tell I'm passionate about this kind of thing. I think it's undervalued, the importance of citation processing, because it's not the sexy thing anymore, right? It's been going on for 35 years, really, right? Late 70s in DC is when it really started. But a lot of those folks now are retiring. Just Shuley, some of you know, just yesterday through IPMI, his retirement, right? Barbara Chance. I mean, there are folks, Duke Hanson, there are folks that have done this their whole careers, but now it's just not the sexy thing. It's curb management. It's, dynamic pricing. It's sensors. It's, apps. I get all of that, but I think at the core, effectively collecting parking tickets is really important. So I think anything you guys can do from the groundswell or through SWAPTA to encourage IPMI to focus on this, I think would be well worth it. Well, I know we're getting close to the end here, so let me, for those of you Just go to the end. Who don't know me or have my contact information, it's pretty simple. mnickolaus@gmail, and that's my number. So you can feel free to reach out. You'll have it once this presentation is distributed as well. Any last questions?
All right, thank you so much, Mike. This has been really informative. We really appreciate it. And just a reminder for everyone to visit our SWAPTA website, Southwest Parking, and check out our future webinars and social activities that are coming up. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.